I'm Lisa Benchia. I'm the manager of travel and special programs here at the museum. A quick friendly reminder to please turn off the sound on your cell phones. Thank you. SBMA's Travel Armchair Lecture Series takes you on a trip to otherworldly destinations, all from your armchair on a Sunday afternoon. We have a robust museum travel program to all corners of the world, and today we are delighted to bring those travels to you. Today we will hear from author Daniel Stone, a best-selling author whom Wall Street Journal calls an amiable narrator who balances botany, culinary history, and travel log. Stone writes for National Geographic and is a former White House correspondent for Newsweek. He has written for Time Magazine, The Washington Post, Vice, and Literary Hub. He teaches environmental policy at Johns Hopkins University and has recently relocated to Santa Barbara, so he is now our neighbor. And today he will tell us about the true story of an American food spy who traveled the world and transformed what America eats. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Daniel Stone.
Awesome. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, all of you, for being here. As Lisa mentioned, my wife, Alana, and I, she's here. We moved to Santa Barbara about 5 months ago, and it's not only a treat to live here, but a treat to sort of find our place in the community and in places with such sort of rich goings-on as the Art Museum here. So thank you to the museum, and again, thank you to all of you for coming. I wrote this book, The Food Explorer. It came out about a year and a half ago. And it's the story, as Lisa mentioned, of a food spy for the U.S. government. What is a food spy? I will tell you all about it. But I wanted to start just by backing up a little bit. This is a map that we ran in National Geographic, the magazine, about 5 years ago. And it accompanied a story about the origins of our most common foods. Right? Where do these things come from? And the story was sort of meant to smack you, a little bit and say the things that you think that are American are in fact not, right? Apples that we think of from Washington State, right? Those all come originally from Kazakhstan. All oranges and lemons and citrus of any kind that we grow a lot of here originated in Southeast China. And bananas. Bananas are the single most sold item at Walmart. And we all, use them as part of our diet every day. They're from Papua New Guinea, where there are still thousands of varieties of bananas that are endemic, whereas we mainly have access to one here. And the story sort of made this point that, all of our food came to this country as many people did, right? As many of our ancestors and grandparents did. They came as immigrants. They came over time, they came on boats, they came in small quantities and sort of entrenched themselves and grew into major industries. And that's kind of the work of a food spy. And what I want to tell you and who I'd like to introduce you to, let's see. This here is a man named David Fairchild, and he's the one I refer to as the food spy and the food explorer. Fairchild was a young man from Kansas who grew up surrounded by a lot of people who were very anxious about farming, right? Farming was more than half of the U.S. economy. Most people were farmers in those days, and they were really frustrated and anxious about what they were growing and how everyone was growing pretty much the same thing, right? Corn, oats, a lot of livestock, beef, barley, a lot of gourds, pumpkins, right? And tomatoes. Those were kind of the main crops of North America until about 150 years ago when Fairchild is born, right after the Civil War in Kansas. And the effect of such kind of lack of diversity among these crops is the market is so flooded with all of those things I mentioned, right? If you're selling corn, if you're selling oats or barley, your neighbor is too, and the market is so full that no one is making much money. And the more everyone produces, the lower the price goes, right? Basic sort of supply and demand. So Fairchild has this desire that he says, well, what if there's more out there? What if I can travel and find new crops around the world and introduce them to American farmers, to American markets, and grow new industries around new fruits, new vegetables, new items, plants that we could use to grow, to make clothing, new plants that we could use to build houses, anything that can be new and economically useful. That's was his initial goal. And he takes this idea to Washington. He becomes a junior scientist for the USDA. This is his yearbook picture on the left, back when the government took yearbook pictures. And on the right is kind of his action shot of him at work. And in these days, most of the work of the USDA was kind of this. It was reactive problem solving for a blight or a fungus or some crop disease that was taking out a certain type of crop. And so government scientists and chemists would concoct some pesticide or some mixture that none of us would want to even step near today, right? And they'd fill it in that tank and he'd go around and he'd spray. And that was kind of like the role of a government scientist for the USDA. Until Fairchild comes up with this idea to travel. And it's a compelling idea and it's relatively cheap, right? Here's a young man who's willing to go on steamships all over the world at great personal risk, but pretty low cost relative to the federal budget. So he gets this opportunity and he gets his first assignment. This is a photo that Fairchild takes, and almost all the photos I'll show you today are taken by Fairchild himself. His first assignment is to go to Corsica, an island right in the Mediterranean. It was once Italian. When he goes, it's now a French island. And Corsica grows the best citron in the world. Right? Citron is a type of citrus. It's sort of related to a lemon. It's sour. In Jewish tradition, it's also known as an etrog, right? And so Corsicans grow the best citron on earth. And the USDA thinks that Corsican citron could be useful for California citrus growers, right? Here's an industry that hasn't had much new breed stock in a long time. And if we can introduce Corsican citron, we'll have a competitive citron and citrus industry. Now, these are the decades before sort of the orange boom of California, Orange County, the orange groves. Citron is really, the fuel that can really enrich this market. So Fairchild is sent to Corsica with the assignment to acquire, however necessary. And he's, I think he's 23 at the time. He's very excited, as anyone would be, to get sort of a top secret mission from their government. But he's very bad at this work. Right, so he hires a donkey to sort of go up to the top of this mountain town where they grow a lot of citron. He tries to meet the mayor. It doesn't really work, and he's out in the street trying to blend in. But he's also got his giant Eastman Kodak camera with the curtain, right, and the big tripod, and he starts taking photos. And he sets this photo, and he's got his head under the curtain, and he takes this image, and then he gets arrested. Right, instantly. And he gets interrogated. What are you doing here? Who are you? He speaks no French. And he sort of makes clear that he's more of a bumbling idiot than like a government spy. Right? So they let him go. And he rides down the mountain. And as he's riding, he looks behind him. He's not being pursued. And he darts off the donkey and into a grove of citron. He takes 3 cuttings. He takes 3 fruit also. And he stuffs the little wood cuttings, the little twigs, down at the bottom of the mountain in potatoes so that they'll be nourished on their steamship ride back to the U.S. And he's successful, right? These are received in Washington. They're propagated in government greenhouses. They're sent out to government scientists in California and shared with farmers and really do help prop up the citron market as was intended by the government. So he has this kind of successful record from his first kind of haphazard but ultimately successful experiment. On a different trip, he goes around the coast of South America, and it's in Chile that he comes across a fruit that he had seen before but wasn't terribly familiar with and certainly had never seen a great quality avocado. Right? And that's a fruit he used to call the alligator pear, right? The name avocado comes from the Aztec word ahuacatl, which means testicle, for how avocados grow. That's how they named it. Fun fact for your next cocktail party. Fairchild picks up Chilean avocados, which he thinks are superior to any avocado he's seen, right? What makes an avocado or any fruit superior to ones, in its same class, right? He sees that it has thick skin, thicker than most. It has a smallish stone, so there's a lot more fruit. There's a lot more meat. It's not stringy. It's more creamy than he's ever seen. And it doesn't really bruise that easily. Also, it grows really fast, unlike other avocados. So he says this is a candidate. The latitude of Santiago, where he picks this up, is the exact same latitude, inverted, in the northern hemisphere as Los Angeles. Right? So he says they're both on the Pacific Ocean. If we can expect similar weather and climate, then we could grow this fruit pretty well in California. So he sends about 1,000 of these avocados back to Washington. The same process. They're received, they're propagated, they're shared with scientists in breeding stations in California. They're also shared with growers, with enthusiasts, with gardeners, with chefs, people who, over the course of several decades, make avocados part of the culture, agricultural culture and pop culinary culture. And the effect of this, it took a long time, but, you could sort of imagine, based on where avocados are in our kind of pop diet today, what happened, right? So on the right here is, this arrived about 3 decades after Fairchild's initial introduction. And this was a patent filed by a man in, not far from here in Fallbrook, who bred better and better avocados, right? He took Fairchild's original ones and he kept breeding them, and he did a lot of seed splitting and hybridizing to make better avocados every season. And he breeds one that is far superior, right? Its skin is even thicker, its stone is even smaller, it's far less stringy, it lasts a long time, it doesn't bruise, and it only takes a season to start producing fruit. And a friend of his, this man is a letter carrier, he works for the Postal Service, a friend of his says, you should patent this. This is a really great avocado. And he follows his advice and files this patent. And for those with eyes better than mine, you could see on the bottom right here, his name was Rudolf Haas. Here we go, right here, Rudolf Haas. He filed this patent in 1935 and made a lot of money, right? A lot more money than the Postal Service was paying him. Fairchild goes to Baghdad, where he is very enthused at talking with farmers, right? And his process is slowly changing. So unlike Corsica, where he sort of gets in and out, tries not to be noticed, it's very, espionage, spycraft. He starts to develop this process of charming people, of talking with farmers, of flattering them, of making them understand why he wants these things, mainly because he wants their advice. And, that's sort of a timeless thing. To ask for someone's advice is very flattering. And so he goes to these markets like this one, where these men are selling grain, which they cover with these carpets so that they won't be eaten away by birds or rodents. And he says, what are the main crops? What can we use that we can maybe introduce in America and learn from you? And a lot of these farmers are very willing to help. What harm does it do? How does it threaten my crop if some grower in California is growing the same thing? And in Baghdad, he convinces someone to give him about 30 different types of date trees. Date trees, of course, require a very arid climate, a lot of sun, a lot of heat. And Fairchild says, well, maybe this will work in the American Southwest, right? I packed this presentation with a lot of California stories for the audience. And Fairchild says, what about kind of the San Bernardino Valley or inland over toward Palm Springs or Indio, where you have that exact same climate analogy? Fairchild gets about 30 different date suckers, these mini date trees that he wraps in layers of clay and mud. so that the outer layer will dry out, but the inner layer will retain the moisture so that it can survive about 2 months on a boat. He was always trying new methods of packing. And any of you who are like me, who struggle to keep any plant alive for any period of time, will marvel at the fact that, you could take a plant that needs sun, heat, and a lot, of care, and certainly in moisture, and figure out how to get it to sustain itself for 2 or 3 months on a boat. Fairchild brings these trees back, and he introduces them as he intended to Southern California, and really starts an industry as he intended in the kind of Inland Empire area east of Los Angeles. And this is the first time that an industry really creates itself, right? Avocados were helpful, and they took a long time, but dates, certainly in Palm Springs, dates were a big thing, right? You could almost plant them instantly, fruit would come almost instantly, and it was a major source of economic activity and influx and income. Anyone who's been out to Palm Springs, I'm sure many of you have, know that dates are a big part of the culture there still. You could, buy dates. You could drink date shakes. You could see date palms. That's mainly the result of Fairchild and the small team by this point that he had built, who was also going around the world finding these things to introduce. Here is a photo Fairchild took in Japan, where he spends an entire summer in 1901. And he really falls in love with these types of trees, which some of you could tell are known in Japan as sakura trees, right? Sakura trees, also known as cherry blossom trees, are beautiful, but they're not very useful, right? They're not economically useful. They don't produce a fruit. There's no cherries. So there's nothing you can sell, and there's no economic potential. So Fairchild sees them, marvels at them, sort of forgets about them, and goes home to his house in Maryland. And when he gets married several years later. Fairchild actually marries the daughter of Alexander Graham Bell. And as part of their marriage, they get this big piece of land north of Washington, D.C., where Fairchild says, I want to plant some of those cherry blossom trees on my own land because I think they were so beautiful. And he writes to his friend in Japan who said, he says, send me some trees. So he does, and he plants them. And people start noticing, right? The way you notice kind of your neighbor whose garden looks better than your own, right? People start noticing that it looks great. And they start coming, every season to check it out. And people start coming from Washington, D.C., proper, including members of the government, including members of the cabinet, including the president. President Roosevelt Teddy Roosevelt had been up to Fairchild's property to see these, and President Taft, who came right after him. And Mrs. Taft especially took great interest in these trees. And this came at a time when people were wondering, how can we beautify Washington? How can we make, especially the area by the river, the Potomac River, more beautiful? And Fairchild had this idea, what if we plant more of these trees down near what was known as the Speedway, the tidal basin? And through a long series of negotiations and efforts and steamships and rail cars, Fairchild arranges what we now know as the gift of the Japanese to Washington, D.C., where they plant about 3,000 sakura, cherry blossom trees, right in the heart of the capital. A lot of those were planted in 1912. Most of those trees last about 25 to 35 years is their lifespan, but there are still 4 original trees planted in Washington, which you could tell by sort of the girth of their trunks, right? They're, at least kind of 10 feet around versus the very prim and thin new ones that are planted and sort of propagated and maintained new every few years. Over time, this is a map we had commissioned for the book, which I call the Fruits of Fairchild, right? These are not all of his acquisitions, but certainly his greatest hits. And I mentioned some of them. Here's, let's see, avocados down here in Chile. He picked up more than 50 varieties of mangoes from India all the way over to the Philippines. Varieties of nectarines in Pakistan, and there are the dates I mentioned in Baghdad. he picked up seedless grapes for some of the first introductions to California of seedless grapes right outside of Venice, Italy. And he picks up hops, hops, right in a part of Bavaria where he sort of cajoles the growers into giving him hops to create a rival to the best hops in the world. That's how he flatters them. Bavarian hops, Germans are very proud of their beer. He flatters them by buying a plaque for one of the growers' houses and drinking with them in the beer hall to get them to share some of their prized crop. As a side note, I know Lisa and the museum have planned some beer, some hop-heavy German beer for us to enjoy after, based on that introduction. And sort of at the other end of things people love, here Fairchild introduces kale from Croatia. And I will tell you, from going around the country talking about this book, nothing fires people up like kale. Yeah. People love it or they despise it. That's it's one or the other. That's usually. There are a couple others I'll just point to. Fairchild picks up a variety of long grain fiber cotton in Egypt that he introduces to the American sort of southwest of Arizona and New Mexico. Becomes known as Egyptian cotton and the finest in the world. And varieties of papayas down here in what was then called Ceylon or Sri Lanka. Now I'm pointing to a lot of Fairchild's, big successes. Every effort, certainly something that comes with a lot of risk, brings the chance of failure also. Things that he introduced that never really caught on. One of them is down here, sort of South Africa. This is a dwarf pineapple that he introduces from just outside of Johannesburg. And Fairchild thinks that dwarf pineapples will be sort of world-changing. That who wouldn't want their own pineapple the same way you have your own apple? Just one serving, that's it. And he gets very excited about this. And growers in the U.S., certainly in Hawaii at the time, which was not yet a state, but was an American territory, they said, no, the money for pineapples is in size and weight. We want bigger and bigger pineapples. And that's why when you go to kind of Costco, right, you're used to kind of the 4-foot-tall pineapple that compared to the earlier ones, certainly more endemic pineapples that, certainly were not much bigger than the dwarf pineapple when they first appeared. The other failure, kind of one of Fairchild's big failures and great disappointments, is this fruit down on the bottom right. It's a purple fruit, and it's known as someone said it. Did someone say it? Mangosteen. Yeah, someone just said it. And here on the right is a mangosteen. On the left, by the way, is a painting of a citron that I mentioned from Corsica, kind of a bumpy lemon. So this is a mangosteen. It was one of Fairchild's proudest introductions, and of all of the thousands of fruits he had tried all over the world, this was his favorite. Right? This was number one. He called it the queen of fruits. And it's a purple fruit, right, with the white kind of wedges inside, and the white part is what you eat. And he thought that, it was the most delicious thing he had ever tasted, and he wanted to share it with every American. He wanted to get farmers growing it, and it never caught on. And if you think about why, and I'll tell you why, but it didn't catch on for kind of the theory of a resume that every fruit has, right? Why are there thousands of fruits in the world, but when you go into Whole Foods or Safeway or Ralph's, there's only about 15 that you have the choice of, right? Maybe 20, but really not so many. And the mangosteen explains why, right? So like I said, the rind, this purple part, is very thick. So there's a lot of weight that you don't eat, that you throw away, that you have to ship anyway, right? So it's kind of expensive to ship for not a lot of fruit. These white wedges that you eat are delicious. They taste like custard, but there's not a lot to them. And there's a little pit inside the very inside. So, it's kind of delicate to eat. It's kind of messy with your fingers. They ripen very quickly. You have about 2 or 3 days after you get them off of a tree before they start to to go bad, and they bruise very easily. So you can't really ship them in a crate unless you pack them individually. So by the time you kind of account for all of those things, if you really still wanted to have mangosteens in Santa Barbara, you'd ship them fast, you'd pack them individually, you'd pick the best ones on the tree, and you'd get someone like you or me who really, really wanted it and was willing to pay a lot for it. And mangosteens then end up about $10 to $15 a pound, right? They just can't really compete with kind of the 1% of fruits, I call them, the bananas, the apples, the citrus, things that are bred, to be hardy, that ship really well, that last a long time, that have thick skins and don't bruise. The mangosteen just sort of wasn't up to snuff. And nor was, frankly, the dwarf pineapple, as I mentioned. But fruits change, right? We all know that fruits are bred and rebred every year, that we see new varieties of certainly things like apples that we've never seen before in the supermarket. And I was sort of flummoxed. This was about 2 years ago. And this was in the Whole Foods where we used to live in Washington, D.C. Dwarf pineapples, right, for sale. And you could sort of see how big they are. These are mangoes right next to them, right? So they're like really small. But also they're like $5 each, right? And so I almost bought one. I wrote a book about these things, and I almost bought one. And so you can't. I didn't expect that many people would buy these things, and they were sort of a novelty. So some fruits catch on, and some fruits certainly don't. With the time remaining here, I thought, a lot of people ask me. They say, "Wow, that's such interesting work, but can you still do that today? Is there enough of the world that we don't know enough about that we can still explore for novel fruits and vegetables?" And the answer really is not really. Our world is connected. There's not a lot of sort of mysterious things to discover that no one has ever seen before, certainly in the way of bare food ingredients, right? We're doing a lot of research on the nutrition of ingredients, how to make fruits and vegetables last longer. What can we bring to market that has the resume and credentials that can withstand, kind of that scrutiny? But the work of Fairchild, of running around the world and sort of stumbling upon new things, of something no one had ever seen before, is not really, work that is continuing today. But we think a lot about how does food change, right? How does food change, and how does food research change? How does food adventure change? Any of you who have traveled, certainly who have gone on trips with the museum here, know that, there's always something new to explore. There are always new questions. And everywhere you go, even if someone's discovered it before you, there's always kind of a novel way that you can look at something or experience a place or a thing. And so at National Geographic, we ask this question a lot. Not necessarily what are the foods that will be our future, but how can you use those foods and use what already exists to feed a growing world? And I want to take you through a couple of the things that we've identified that are kind of the exact same questions that Fairchild was asking. He was looking at how to build a country, how to sustain a growing population economically and also culinarily. And we're asking the same questions. How can you, build the world, build our agricultural systems to meet the needs of more and more people? Number one, is how we use land. So I think if Fairchild was still alive, he would be in the USDA office in Washington, hunched over a map like this, looking at what is grown and where it's grown. And so, I know the font is very small here, so I will read you all of these. On the right, we have sort of where food is grown, right? This is all agricultural land, and you could sort of see the color, how it changes, of where we grow food in this country, right? There we go. Where agriculture exists. Right now, I think the most interesting map is the second map, which is how our cropland is used, right? So the kind of the far end on the right here of how our that's for feed and fuel, right? That's what our land is for, that color. On the other side, this kind of richer, lighter color. That's mainly where we grow our food. So those of us in California, we know very well that California grows a lot of the nation's food. You could see it on that map. But what's interesting, the purple and the blue in there is where fuel and feed are produced. And we have some of the richest farmland in the world, certainly in the Midwest, and we use a lot of it for feed and fuel. So in order to feed more people, can we make better use of that land? Can we sort of grow sort of the lower priority or sort of certainly lower quality crops for feed in different parts of the country so that we can use more of that rich soil in the Midwest for the food that more of the world's population will need. And then you could see here on the right, this says, where yields could improve. This all came from a report from the UN and the Food and Agriculture Organization about thinking about the future. Where yields can improve, right? Exactly the places that are sort of rich in color on the second map, where we don't sort of make the best use of land, even in this country, and certainly in other countries around the world. How can you sort of make land more efficient? How can you use land in a way that maybe you hadn't thought of before? This is an extreme example. This is a farmhouse in just outside of Amsterdam, right? It looks very Dutch. But yeah, someone who said, well, I can't grow my original crop, whatever it was, all year round, but if I build greenhouses at pretty extreme expense, then suddenly I can, multiply my crop and I could hyper manipulate the growing conditions. The same way maybe Fairchild was thinking about, how can we use this crop in a different part of America? How can we optimize it and how can we make it work for us? The second one is accounting for changing diets, right? Now, this is always kind of an interesting stat I like to mention of over the next 30 years, the world's population will increase by about a third, right? We're going to go from about 7 billion to about 10 billion people. And as a result of that, we're going to have to double the amount of food and feed, animal feed, that we produce, right? So even adding 35% more people, we're going to have to add 100% more crop output, right? That's the estimation, again, of the UN. And why is that, right? These words are hard to read, but this bar sort of says it all, which is that developing countries are increasing their appetite for meat, right? So feeding those pigs, those cows, those chickens is going to take substantially more crop output in the form of feed, a lot of corn, a lot of potatoes, all the things you can feed that have a lot of byproducts that we're going to need to figure out how to use land smarter and better and put it to work over the next 30 years, right? That's not the long-term horizon. That's in many of our lifespans, right? How are we going to double the crop output? Next one is minding our food waste, right? This one affects all of us. We think of it a lot in our household. But some of these numbers that you can see of the conservative estimates of how much food is wasted in all of our daily lives, right? Cereal's 30%. Dairy, who hasn't found a sort of rotten gallon of milk in the fridge, right? 20%. Fish and seafood, 35%, and fruits and vegetables, almost half, 45%, right? So we did a story in National Geographic on food waste and sort of went to see photographically how it happens. It happens at every stage, right? But from farm to wholesaler to retailer to your kitchen, at every step, things are shed off. Things just don't really fit. We found this fellow, and this is an entire truck's worth of bananas that just sort of weren't up to snuff. They were bruised, or they were cut sort of wrong, and they become either fuel for animals or they're burned, right? They're sort of discarded in a way that makes sense. This one to me is more surprising. Any of us who buy those like cuties or little mandarins in the supermarket, ever notice how they're all pretty much exactly the same size, which is not really how fruit grows, right? So, these oranges or these clementines, whatever, they go down this line and they're sorted to be exact, right? Exactly shiny, exactly perfect. They're tested for pressure to make sure that when you open them, they have the highest likelihood of being sweet, right? And that means a lot are weeded out and frankly just not used. And so our relationship with waste really does have to change, and it kind of happens and needs to happen at every level. And the last one is how we harness technology. We think a lot about the future of food. What are we going to be eating in the future? I don't think the answer is really in ingredients, that there's going to be some novel food that comes that none of us have ever heard of. What's probably more likely is we do a lot of nutrition research and find out that this one thing that we've been eating for like 200 years is full of far more nutrients than we ever thought, right? Like blueberries or avocados or acai berries, but not really much in the way of new food. There are a lot of companies, and a lot of them are based here in California, that are working on these kinds of questions. How can we use technology not only to produce more food, but produce it more reliably and produce it in a way that is more nutritious, maybe? How can we maximize the nutritional component, minimize maybe the risk that something comes with, and grow it to the exact specifications that we want? Right? This is actually a company based in right outside of Boston that uses infrared and LED and infrared lights to basically mimic the perfect growing conditions for any number of plants, right? And here I think they're working with alfalfa and corn. Certainly they grow potatoes and carrots, kind of high intensity crops, not just the little microgreens that you can sort of grow in a 5th grade classroom, things people actually eat, right? And so this is the light up top that is optimized to the exact wavelength to meet these plants' needs. So you can do 5 growing seasons in the span of time of one normal conventional growing season, right? How can you produce way more output with not that much energy input, right? LED lights, we all know, are very efficient. It's a relatively new technology that you can put to work for farming. Is this the future of what we're all going to eat? Probably not. Certainly not for the short term, but it does supplement and it does add to that 100% more output that we'll require over the next few decades. And this is an interesting one, and this is a Santa Barbara one that we did a story in Geographic years ago that I still love talking about. There's a company in Goleta, many of you are familiar with, I'm sure, called Appeal. And Appeal is working on basically adding an extra layer of peel to your common household and supermarket foods, right? Pears, avocados, strawberries. How can you sort of slow the respiration of a fruit, right? A fruit only has so many breaths it can take after it's been cut, right? And when it sort of slows down its breathing, that's when its immune system falls away and microorganisms get in that make it mold or ripen or spoil. So if you can sort of fortify and strengthen that skin, maybe you could extend the shelf life of that fruit by double or triple. And they're working on, for some fruits, quadruple. And I'm not sure how we can, let's see. Oh, this is kind of a simulation that we did that sort of shows the effect of this. Again, this is happening in Goleta, of treated with this extra layer of skin versus kind of moldy, untreated strawberry on the left. At here, maybe I could play it again. There we go. At Geographic, everything is very photo driven. People love the photographs in the magazine, and the photos are always beautiful, right? They have to be beautiful. So when we were preparing the story, the photo director said, "We can't run that. Who wants to look at a moldy strawberry?" And so the way that we did it in the story was we kind of did, it was on a single portrait page, and we had both kind of strawberry profiles next to each other, and we took a screenshot of the moldy strawberry at the precise moment when it doesn't look like mold, but it looks like snow. Yeah. So it looks beautiful just before it gets ugly. So this is work that's going on here in California. Certainly a lot of people are really focused on the future, and they're asking the same questions as Fairchild. How can we produce more? How can we produce it responsibly? How can we stretch it further? How can we fuel communities and economies that can benefit from food and agriculture in this industry that ultimately touches all of our lives every day? Before I end, I want to just jump back to the past to talk about sort of the difference of this kind of work versus what it was in Fairchild's day. Now, Fairchild, of course, he runs around the world for about 20 years. He gets married. He can't really do it as freely anymore. He has kids. And so he hires a team of young men to continue this work for him. This is in the 19-teens. And one of those men is this fellow. His name is Frank Meyer. And his job, given by Fairchild, is to walk across China, right? To go and just wander around, see what he can find, right? Now, that's very different from what Appeal is doing in Goleta, right? But it's sort of in the same spirit of, what can we do to ask new questions in the new frontier of what is possible in terms of food. So Meyer goes around China. He has these kind of harrowing experiences. He's all alone. He gets robbed. He gets beaten up. He gets attacked by wild animals. He sleeps in sort of the most sordid guest houses, that you can imagine based on his writing, his letters back to Fairchild. And eventually he kind of goes crazy, right? All this time alone, all this wandering around of being mistrusted as a white man by people who have never seen a white person before, in this very kind of sensitive time of of not much, immigration and not friendly relations between the two countries. And Meyer kind of goes crazy, but he has remarkable success. He picks up varieties of oats, new varieties of soybeans, which eventually become kind of the crop of the Midwest and much of America. He picks up wild pears that are eventually grown here in California. He even brings back a pair of gelada monkeys that he brings back in cages, which he greatly regretted because of what a pain they were. But he donates them to the National Zoo in Washington. And, this kind of work, certainly for the government, doesn't happen at all anymore. And Meyer himself is not really remembered, right? Many of us haven't heard his name, haven't seen him referenced in places, but he is sort of a instrumental person and very influential figure in our diets and what we eat and why we have what we do. For all of Meyer's work, he is only named, his name is only used in the acquisition of one crop that he uses. He finds this lemon in a woman's doorway right outside of Shanghai, and he finds it to be remarkable, right? Remarkable in that this is a region where citrus is endemic, where they have thousands of varieties of different types of citrus. They still do. But what's unique about this one, it's sweeter than a lemon. It's more tart than an orange. And he suspects it's a natural hybrid of the two, which later genetic science reveals that it pretty much is. And so he introduces it, and it's first grown in Chico and eventually all throughout much of the California kind of citrus region, and in Texas and in Florida, where you can really grow citrus. This, of course, now we know as the Meyer lemon. It is a favorite of Alice Waters, of Martha Stewart. Right? People love to cook with it or make lemonade with it because of its kind of very attractive taste. And, like I said, Meyer did a lot of work. This is kind of the only one that really got his name attached to it. And he and Fairchild were modest in that sense, right? They never really sought out glory. They were traveling a lot, so they never really were here for newspaper profiles or magazine stories about them. They were also government workers, so they weren't kind of these titans of industries like Alexander Graham Bell or Steve Jobs, right? These big egos that sort of funnel the fuel of energy in their industry. They were kind of these, happy bureaucrats who did the work that was required of them in their time and didn't really ask for much in return. But there was in my research that I found a couple flashes of kind of the recognition that they knew that this work would be very influential, that would be long-lasting, and whose effect would be seen long into the future. And, the reason I know about Meyer and Fairchild and their sort of relationship while Meyer was traveling was because of the letters that they wrote each other. Over the course of years, just every couple months, long letters explaining what was going on, encouraging each other along in the days before World War I. And in one letter, I found a snippet where Meyer kind of lets loose and tips his hand to, knowing what effect this work is having. And this is in 1915. And he says, conditions are hard, but I will be famous one day. Just wait a century or two. Yeah. Thanks very much for coming. I'm happy to take some questions. Yes.
I had a question. So you've talked about a little bit about like diversity and introducing different types of fruits and vegetables. Can you comment on the seed industry and how that's become more of a monopoly of like larger industries and how a lot of seeds have become less diverse?
Yeah, the question is the seed industry, and we hear the term a lot, monocultures. Is that what you're kind of referring to?
I'm not too familiar with it. I was just curious.
Yeah. In Fairchild's day, the goal was food diversity, right? In our day, it's more sort of food efficiency. We don't need every sort of food on earth. We just need the few that can be produced really reliably, efficiently, cheaply, freshly, all the ways that are smooth and easy and cheap. And that was kind of a change in like the 1950s when the government said, we don't really need to go out and find these things anymore. We need to get better at producing them. And that provided the incentive for companies that eventually became the Monsantos, Syngentas, DuPonts to invest in seed research. So we don't need to find something to replace corn. Let's make better corn. Let's get the corn that we have in a lab and find out how to seed splice it, how to hybridize it, how to make it grow twice as dense on the same amount of land with less water, with less sunshine in shorter period of time. And, that's science, right? Like, trying to make something work better. The effect of that has been if you put all that investing money into anything, you sort of own an element of it, or, you deserve the spoils of whether it works. That works in our patent system. It works if you develop the next iPhone, you deserve to get really rich off of it. It's always been controversial and a very hard question to answer whether food should be the same. Right? If someone's developing a new type of strawberry, do they deserve a patent for it to protect it in ways that sort of box out their neighbors, that disadvantage a whole series of people, and that might contain some sort of genetic element that is proprietary, right? These are all questions. I don't have the answer. I'm more of a journalist and a reporter, but I do think people have been asking those questions since the 1950s, and that's probably far more the future than we think, that, science infused in our food. Yeah. I will say one addendum to that is that science has been infused in our pharmaceuticals pretty much forever. And those of us who might be a little queasy about genetically modified anything, if you've ever taken kind of a medicine that you've gotten at the pharmacy, has included some form of genetic modifications. So we're comfortable with it in some ways, but less so in others. Yeah. Yes?
You mentioned Fairchild as a government bureaucrat.
Right.
When in fact his two biggest expeditions were underwritten by wealthy patrons who paid for about 90 to 95% of the cost of those expeditions all over the world, it would never have been possible on the money that he was given by the government to do any of the work that he did. So it seems important that sponsorship is clear.
Yes, thank you for pointing that out. Had I had double the amount of time, I would have referenced that Fairchild's early expeditions, and this is sort of all in the book I wrote, were funded by wealthy men, particularly one wealthy man who Fairchild traveled with for more than a decade, who was a millionaire from Chicago named Barber Lathrop, who just took an interest in young Fairchild as kind of a young man of science, a young man to invest in. And it wasn't really till Fairchild proved his concept of traveling around the world and finding new things that the government said, okay, we'll pay for your expenses, or, we'll pay your salary if someone else pays for your expenses. And they found creative arrangements. But you're right. Yeah, Fairchild was extremely good at plant hunting, but even better at finding rich people to underwrite his hobbies and his acquisitions. Thank you for that. I'm thrilled you knew that. Maybe you knew it from the book, or just a...
His second expedition to Africa was also funded by the man's son who invented the grain elevator. So that was a pretty big...
Yeah, he went on 4 major expeditions that were all funded by different people, all the way into his late 70s. He was still traveling.
He has one of the biggest gardens in America named after him, so I guess that's something too.
Yeah, those of you who have been to kind of South Florida and Miami, most of where I did my research was at the Fairchild Tropical Botanical Garden. That was made possible by a gift of basically a man who made his fortune in accounting literature, and he gave many millions of dollars in the 1920s for the Fairchild Garden, which still exists. It's worth seeing. There aren't many places in the country where you can grow tropical crops, tropical plants at all. That's one of them, and we are lucky to live here in another. Yeah. Did you have a question a minute ago? No? Yes.
When I grew up in Chicago in the 60s, we only had iceberg lettuce. Where did all this other wonderful lettuce come from?
You mean in the way of spinach and arugula and...
Red leaf and radicchio and who knows what.
A lot of lettuce comes from that place, near where I mentioned Kale came from. Yeah, kind of that like Eastern European, Northern European. And most of those lettuces were not really prized for a long time. And I'll give the example of kale, which is sort of maybe the top of that class for now. Kale was kind of a peasant food for hundreds of years, right? It grew really easily. It took salt out of soil. It was really light. It wasn't really good, right? Still isn't. But, but now that we know it's like really healthy, so people eat a lot of it. And yeah, it became easier to grow at large scale. It's certainly easy to ship. And maybe growers in, California or in the Midwest or areas that they realized, we could sort of get in on this industry that's becoming more popular. But it wasn't a popular industry probably when you were a kid. Probably even when I was a kid, that, we didn't eat much spinach, kale, arugula. We had iceberg lettuce, with ranch dressing. That was good enough, Certainly that's changed. Yeah. Yes.
Oh, I was going to say about kale. I think it's the idea of nutrient density that has gotten it really to be a star, which I think is to a point that you made that we'll find out more and more about foods that are richer in nutrition. But I was also going to comment that I think the vast majority of new species and seeds are generated by public universities, and it's just public information.
This is a fascinating area, and I wish we had more time together because a lot of this research is still done by public funding, right? There are kind of the Monsantos that I mentioned, but I went to school at UC Davis up north that has a huge seed breeding program, right? Certainly apples, there's a whole apple research center at the University of Minnesota, and University of Wisconsin does apples also. So much of what we eat kind of comes out of public labs, either for the government or universities funded by their state governments. Yeah, it's, I'll just mention that there are still, from Fairchild's day now, there are a series of seed libraries, and they're just called USDA research stations that are all over the country. I think there's 9 of them, 9 or 11, and they hold kind of the vault of required necessary seeds in that region. So in Florida, it's a lot of citrus. In Iowa, it's a lot of kind of wheat and these wavy crops that, are grown at great scale there. And if you're a farmer who lives up there, or a food company like a Nestle or Pepsi or anyone, you can go into those government libraries, they're effective libraries, and take out some of that genetic material and use it to produce your next season of crops, or use it to develop a new type of chocolate or a new type of apple or a new type of anything, which is a government service we hear nothing about, right? Which is sort of crucial and central, and one of those essential things that the government does that, would be a shame if it was unfunded or underfunded. Yeah. Take just a couple more. Yes?
One thing you haven't mentioned is the tomato. Is that always here?
The tomato is mainly from the north coast of South America, and so it had gotten here. What's interesting, people had been growing tomatoes before Fairchild. What's interesting about tomatoes is tomatoes are one of the first globalized crops. If you think of a cuisine that uses tomatoes as its kind of central component, we think of Italian, right? Tomatoes are nowhere near Italy in their origin, but things had passed through these kind of rich civilizations in Egypt, in Mesopotamia, in Baghdad, and certainly in Venice, the eras of Marco Polo and explorers around the world who brought these ingredients that became kind of the core. Wheat is mostly from Russia, not Italy. Tomatoes are mostly from like Colombia, not Italy, and yet now they kind of own them. Yeah. Yes, in the back.
You had mentioned the local corporation in Goleta Appeal.
Yeah.
And you said a second skin was something they were developing. Is that a spray that could go over fruits and vegetables, or could you explain a little bit more?
Sure. Appeal was founded as a material science company. It was founded by a material scientist from UCSB who basically developed the process. And you should Google this because I don't want to butcher it for them. But the basic premise is that they extract the lipids from, say, an avocado. So the original kind of fat cells inside the avocado, and they kind of make that into what is a powder. And it's an organic powder if the avocado was organic to begin with. And that becomes the skin. So, they call it a rinse. They put this rinse of its own cells onto it. It's very sensitive, I think, in their field and industry to use a word like spray, right? All of us have. So, yeah, no, but I mean, it's the process of applying its own cells back onto it in a kind of highly scientific way. Yeah. Yes, last one.
I am curious how you got interested in this and what your background is.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm a product of the UC system. I went to Davis, and then I moved out to DC to get into journalism. Really enjoyed environmental journalism, and at National Geographic, where I was a senior editor, I came across reference of Fairchild one day. And as I mentioned, Fairchild married the daughter of Alexander Graham Bell. So Graham Bell had two daughters, one of whom married a guy named Gil Grosvenor, who became the 50-year-long editor of National Geographic. And the other daughter married a guy who was described as an adventurer botanist, right? That was it. And so in geographic lore, the other daughter sort of did better, right? Like she kind of had like the more flashy husband. And Fairchild was kind of a footnote. And because of my sort of fascination with this world and certainly with plants and seed production, I dug into him. I found more and more about him. I found his family. He still has grandkids who live in Florida, and they had several of his diaries and his notes. The Fairchild Garden in Miami, they had his travel manifests and a lot of his notes from traveling and his government memos. And, you look at a book like this and you think, well, it's sort of seamless and you just, started, first word to last word. But it kind of grows, any big project kind of grows like a snowball. And the more you dig, the more you find, and the more you sort of stuff it together. I'll tell one quick story before we leave each other, which is Fairchild has grandkids also who live in Nova Scotia. They live on the old estate of Alexander Graham Bell, who was their great-grandfather, right? They're still alive. And I went up to visit them, and I said, I'm writing a book about your grandfather. I think he's fascinating. I want to know as much as I can. And I have a lot of material about his work, but I don't have a lot about himself, right? I want to know, who was this guy? How did he talk? And what made him laugh? And what enraged him? Do you have anything personal about him? And they said, well, we do have this folder upstairs of, some letters. And so one of his granddaughters goes up and she brings down his letters, and it's a big file folder. And on the right side, it says, personal, right? Big red letters, right? It's like the cartoon version of what I'm looking for. And so, I'm like salivating almost and thinking like, this is it. And she says, well, I don't think this is really appropriate for us to share. I mean, these are our grandparents' like personal letters, love letters to each other. They didn't write them to be read by, even them, let alone some kind of stranger author who comes to town. And I said, listen, I fully understand. I have grandparents too. I have a family. I appreciate legacy and concern. Your family kept these for 120 years in hopes or maybe anticipation or who knows why, but, in hopes that maybe one day someone might find them interesting. And I'm here. Yeah. I'm here and I would find them very interesting and please trust me. And they said, okay. So they let me have them for a night and I stayed up all night reading these love letters. There's a whole chapter in the book of this courtship between Fairchild and Marion Bell in 1902 and 1903, and they got married in Washington in 1904. So it added some richness to his story and certainly to his persona, as is told. Yeah. Thank you so much all for coming. I'll be in the lobby. I'm happy to talk to all of you. Thanks.